At 2:17 in the morning, on a cold night over the Kuban front in 1943, a Soviet Polikarpov Po-2 was moving toward the German lines with its engine pulled back so low that the darkness seemed louder than the machine. The aircraft was not much to look at. Wood, fabric, wires. A narrow cockpit opened to the wind. It did not cut through the night like a modern bomber. It trembled through it. Every gust touched the wings. Every vibration came up through the frame and into the hands of the woman holding the control stick. Below, German soldiers were trying to sleep. Not deeply, not peacefully. Sleep near the Eastern Front was never innocent. Men slept with boots nearby, rifles close enough to grab, coats pulled over their faces against the cold. Somewhere behind the camp, a truck engine had been left ticking as it cooled. Somewhere else, a sentry shifted his weight in the mud and listened to the dark with the tired suspicion of a man who had learned that silence did not always mean safety. Inside the Po-2, the pilot did not have the comfort of armor around her. There was no heavy defensive gun turret guarding the rear. No thick metal belly. No pressurized cabin. No clean glass dome separating her from the weather. The cold moved through everything. Found her wrists. Crept under her collar. It made her fingers stiff around the controls. Beside or behind her, the navigator watched the ground and the map, matching black fields to darker strips of road, guessing distances from shapes that could vanish beneath cloud or smoke. There were no dramatic words. There was no heroic speech. In that cockpit, speech was expensive. Breath froze. The engine coughed. The wind took what little sound there was and tore it backward into the night. The target was not a city, not a grand industrial complex, not a place that would appear in history books with arrows and sweeping movements. It was a camp, a road junction, a supply point, a cluster of men and machines that needed rest because the war would demand them again in the morning. That was the thing. Morning always came. The pilot eased the aircraft lower. The Po-2 was so slow that almost anything modern could outrun it. German fighters were faster. German flak was deadlier. German doctrine had been built around force, movement, coordination, and punishment. On paper, this little biplane should not have been a serious problem. But war is not fought on paper. A few seconds before the drop, the engine sound faded. The propeller's pull softened. What remained was stranger. Wind through wires. Air over fabric. A thin, ghostly rush above men who could not see what was coming. One German soldier woke first. Maybe he heard it. Maybe he felt the nervous movement of others before he understood why. A head lifted from a blanket. A hand searched for a rifle. Someone cursed in a low voice. The sentry looked up, but the sky did not offer a shape, only a feeling. Something passing overhead that should have been harmless, if harmless things did not carry bombs. Then the first explosion opened the ground. Not a massive blast. Not the end of a battle. Just enough fire, dirt, noise, and panic to rip a camp out of sleep. Men rolled from bedrolls. A horse screamed somewhere near the transport line. A truck door slammed. Someone fired into the dark too late, sending tracers upward after the aircraft had already moved on. The Po-2 did not stay to admire its work. It turned away, low and fragile, its crew already thinking about the route back, the next landing, the next pair of bombs, the next takeoff before dawn. Because that was what the Germans did not understand at first. The danger was not one aircraft. The danger was that it would come back. They had believed that serious bombing sounded like heavy engines and came from formations high overhead. They had believed a slow Soviet biplane, flown at night by women, could irritate them perhaps, frighten a sentry perhaps, but not change the rhythm of a front. A small bomb could be endured. Primitive aircraft could be mocked. But what really happened was quieter and more damaging. The night itself began to belong to someone else. And before German camps understood what had changed, the men inside them had already started listening upward instead of sleeping. The plane Germany laughed at. To understand the fear the Po-2 created, you first have to see it as its enemies saw it. It was not a machine that looked born for terror. It did not have the brutal authority of a Stuka diving with its siren screaming. It did not have the mass of a heavy bomber, the armored menace of an IL-2, or the sleek confidence of a fighter. It looked older than the war around it. In a conflict of engines, steel, radio networks, radar, tanks, and industrial scale, the Po-2 seemed almost embarrassingly simple. It had been designed before the war as a trainer and utility aircraft. Could fly slowly, could operate from rough fields. It could be repaired without the kind of industrial support that more advanced aircraft demanded. Those were useful qualities, but they were not qualities that made German soldiers think of danger. To a man who had seen artillery tier open a treeline, who had watched tanks grind through villages, who had heard Katyusha rockets arrive like the sky being ripped apart, the Po-2 did not seem like the face of death. It seemed like a nuisance. That belief was not foolish in the beginning. It had logic behind it. A single Po-2 carried a small bomb load. It could not deliver the kind of concentrated destruction German units associated with major air attack. The speed was poor. Its construction was light. Its crew was exposed to weather and gunfire. It could be damaged by weapons far less sophisticated than the guns built to bring down modern aircraft. A soldier with a machine gun and enough luck could be dangerous to it. A searchlight could turn the night into a trap. A burst of flak could shred fabric and wood. So German contempt had evidence. That is why it mattered. The worst mistakes in war often begin with reasonable assumptions. Commanders look at range, speed, armor, payload, numbers. They compare machines. They compare categories. A bomber should be judged by how much it can destroy. A fighter should be judged by how fast it can climb. A tank should be judged by armor and gun. A bridge should be judged by weight. A road by capacity. But the Eastern Front kept punishing clean categories. Mud could stop armor. Cold could kill engines. Distance could defeat supply plans. Hunger could reduce discipline. A destroyed truck could matter more than a destroyed tank if the tank had no fuel. And sleep, that ordinary human requirement no military doctrine could abolish, could become a battlefield target. The Po-2's weakness forced a different kind of war. Because it could not carry many bombs, it did not behave like a conventional bomber. Because it was slow, it could approach in ways fast aircraft did not. Because it could fly low, operate from rough strips, and return again and again, it became part weapon, part alarm clock, part ghost story. It did not need to flatten a camp. It only had to make sure that the men inside never trusted the next hour of darkness. This is where German belief began to split from battlefield reality. They believed a weapon had to be powerful to be important. The Po-2 proved that a weak weapon, used with patience, could create effects no one had properly measured. Could make a road unsafe at night, could make a fuel dump nervous. It could force men out of sleep, then out of shelter, then into exhaustion. It could turn a few kilograms of explosives into hours of lost rest. And the sound mattered. A modern aircraft announced itself with force. The Po-2 did something worse. Near the target, its engine could be reduced or cut, leaving only the thin sound of air moving through the struts and wires. German soldiers who heard it did not hear power. They heard something approaching without the normal warning signs of power. That was the beginning of the nickname, the Night Witches. The name was meant to insult, carried fear, contempt, superstition, irritation. Men reach for names when they cannot control a thing. A name makes the unseen feel smaller. But the name did not make the raid stop. Night after night, the old aircraft returned. On the German side, the first reaction could be anger, then frustration, then fatigue, then a quieter feeling that soldiers often do not admit in reports. Helplessness. Not because the Po-2 was unbeatable. It was not. Not because the pilots were invincible. They were painfully mortal. But because the pattern was so hard to end. Shoot one down and another might come. Sleep after one raid and another might wake you. Laugh at the aircraft in daylight, and by nightfall your ears might be searching for it again. The plane Germany laughed at had found a place where speed mattered less than persistence. It had entered the hours when men were least armored, when command structures thinned, when nerves were exposed, when a tired army became a human thing again. And in that narrow space between darkness and dawn, the obsolete machine began to prove that harmless was a word soldiers used before they understood the cost. The women the system did not expect. Before German soldiers learned to fear the sound of the Po-2, Many Soviet men had to learn to accept the women who would fly it. That part of the story is sometimes softened by legend. The night witches are remembered now with a kind of clean admiration, as if history had always made room for them. But it did not. They had to push their way into a war that needed everything from them, while still doubting what they could do. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the war did not arrive as an abstraction. It came as smoke over cities, bodies on roads, families broken apart, villages abandoned, letters that stopped coming. For young Soviet women who had trained in flying clubs, studied mechanics, learned navigation, or simply grown up inside a culture that celebrated aviation, the question was not whether they cared. The question was whether anyone would allow them to fight in the air. Some had already flown before the war. Some knew engines by sound. Some knew maps, wind, distance, discipline. Others were still raw, driven more by grief and urgency than experience. They wrote letters. They asked to serve, not to pose for posters, not to wave from ceremonies, to fly. But institutions move slowly, even when armies are collapsing. There were men who saw them as brave but impractical, useful perhaps in support roles, good for morale, good for symbols. But combat aviation was different, they thought. Night bombing was cold, disorienting, mechanical, dangerous, and physically punishing. The front did not care about ideals. The sky did not become gentler because the person inside the cockpit was young. That much was true. But the conclusion drawn from it was not. The women were not asking the war to become easier. They were asking for the chance to endure it. There is a particular loneliness in being underestimated by your own side before the enemy has even seen you. German contempt would come later. Soviet skepticism was closer, more personal. It showed up in equipment that did not fit, in uniforms made for men, in doubts spoken casually, in the small humiliations that never appear in operational summaries. Boots too large, jackets too loose, a mechanic's competence questioned twice, a pilot's courage treated as a novelty instead of a fact. The women of the future 588th Night Bomber Regiment were not made of slogans. They were students, daughters, workers, athletes, mechanics, navigators. They got tired. They got cold. They got afraid. Their hands shook after missions. Their eyes burned from wind and sleeplessness. Some were barely out of girlhood, learning to carry maps and bombs in the same life that might once have held exams, dances, family kitchens, summer fields. War compresses age. It makes young faces old in a season. What made them dangerous was not that they lacked fear. It was that they learned how to work through it. Fear became part of the cockpit, like the map board, the throttle, the smell of fuel, the vibration of the wings. They did not conquer it in the theatrical sense. They managed it. They folded it into routine. A pilot climbed in because the aircraft had to go. A navigator checked her route because guessing wrong could kill them. A mechanic patched fabric because a hole ignored on the ground could become a death sentence in the air. An armorer lifted bombs in the dark because someone had to do it before the next sortie. The regiment's story is often told through the pilots, and understandably so. They crossed the lines. They faced the guns. But a night bombing unit was never just two women in a cockpit. It was hands on wheels in the mud. It was ground crews dragging aircraft into position. It was mechanics listening to an engine and hearing trouble before it became visible. It was commanders deciding who would fly again when everyone was already exhausted. The underdog was not only a person. It was a whole system of dismissed labor. And because they were dismissed, they learned to notice what others missed. They understood the Po-2 not as an embarrassment, but as something that could be used. They knew its limitations because they lived with them. They knew it could not survive by pretending to be a modern bomber. It had to survive by becoming something else. What German soldiers would later hear in the dark began here, before the raids, before the nickname, before the fear. It began with women standing beside old aircraft while men wondered if this was a serious unit. They believed these women were an experiment. What really happened was that the experiment learned faster than the people judging it. And once the regiment had pilots, mechanics, navigators, and purpose, it still needed one more thing. Permission from a war machine that had no time left for comfort. Marina Raskova's Impossible Regiment. Marina Raskova understood something that many officers did not want to say aloud. The Soviet Union was bleeding too heavily to waste stability. By the time women's combat aviation units began to take shape, the war had already stripped away many peacetime assumptions. German armies had driven deep into Soviet territory. Cities had burned. Families had been displaced. The front demanded pilots, mechanics, radio operators, clerks, nurses, factory workers, partisans, and replacements for replacements. Every skill mattered, even if pride had not yet caught up with necessity. Raskova was not an unknown dreamer standing outside the institution. She was famous, a record-setting aviator, a figure with enough public weight and political access to make the request harder to dismiss. Women had written to her asking to fight. They did not all write in polished language. Some wrote with grief, some with anger, some with the directness of people who had lost homes and wanted a machine, a route, a target. Raskova became the bridge between that desire and official permission. But permission did not turn into readiness overnight. The women selected for aviation service entered a process shaped by urgency. Training had to be compressed. Standards had to be met under pressure. Mistakes that might have been corrected slowly in peacetime had to be corrected quickly now. The war did not pause because a regiment was new. German units did not wait politely for Soviet women to become comfortable in military life. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment was given a mission that matched the equipment available to it, but that does not mean the mission was easy. Night harassment bombing sounds small until you imagine doing it in an open cockpit, in winter air, over enemy guns, with limited instruments, in a machine that could be torn apart by fire that heavier aircraft might survive. The aircraft themselves said much about how the unit was viewed. The women did not receive the most glamorous machines. They received Po-2 biplanes. Practical, available, simple, and outdated. A lesser unit might have seen that as an insult and stopped there. The night witches made it into a method. Still, in the early days, there must have been a gap between the idea and the reality. A regiment on paper is neat. Names, ranks, equipment, assigned roles. A regiment on the ground is messier. Mud, miscommunication, missing parts, bad weather, new commanders learning their people. People learning whether their courage in theory will hold when the first aircraft does not come home. Yevdokia Bershanskaya, who would command the regiment, had to build discipline out of more than enthusiasm. Enthusiasm can get a volunteer to the airfield, cannot navigate in darkness, cannot repair an engine correctly, cannot hold formation under pressure or judge wind drift over enemy ground. That required training, repetition, and a kind of stern patience that leaves no room for romance. The young women had to become military professionals while the war was already moving around them. They learned to read maps under poor light. They learned the sound of their engines. They learned how cold changes hands, how fear changes breathing, how exhaustion makes simple tasks dangerous. They learned that night flying is not merely day flying without sun. At night, distance lies. The ground hides. Fires deceive. A road that seems obvious on a map may vanish beneath smoke. A river may become a strip of dull metal for 3 seconds and then disappear again. The regiment also learned to live with condescension. That mattered. Not because hurt pride wins wars, but because contempt can kill. If others assume you are ornamental, they may not supply you properly. If they assume your machine is unimportant, they may misunderstand your needs. If they treat your mission as secondary, they may fail to grasp its effect. The women had to prove everything twice. First to their own side, then to the Germans. There is a hard irony in that. The German army would later give them a name that recognized their psychological power before some of their own skeptics fully understood it. Enemy fear became a form of confirmation. But at the start, there was no legend to lean on. There were just old aircraft, new crews, compressed training, and a mission that could be laughed at by anyone who judged war only by weight of metal. Raskova's achievement was not simply that women entered combat aviation. It was that she helped open a door, and then other women had to walk through it under fire. The door did not lead to glory. It led to night air, flak, engine trouble, frozen hands, bad landings, lost friends, and the endless work of being taken seriously in the only language war fully respects. Results. They believed the regiment would be symbolic. What really happened was that symbolism became operational. And soon, the first crews would take the ridiculous idea into the dark, where every theory about weakness would have to survive the sound of German guns. Bombing by moonlight. The idea was almost crude in its simplicity. Take off at night. Fly low. Cross the German lines. Approach the target quietly. Drop the bombs. Return. Reload. Go again. There was no elegance in the description. No grand technological breakthrough. No machine that promised to change the war by itself. Just repetition, nerve, and a slow aircraft doing what faster aircraft could not always do. The Po-2 carried a small load, often only a pair of bombs. In a war measured by tonnage, that sounded almost laughable. A heavy bomber could carry destruction by the thousands of pounds. Artillery could pound a position until the map itself seemed changed. Even a single tank could impose more immediate fear than a wooden biplane moving through the dark. But the Po-2 was not trying to be a heavy bomber. That was the point. This weakness shaped its tactic. Because it could not carry much, it had to return often. Because it was vulnerable, it had to use darkness, altitude, timing, and quiet. Because it was slow, it could be handled in ways that made its final approach difficult to predict. Because it could operate from rough strips close to the front, it could become a nightly visitor instead of a distant event. The crews learned to make the approach feel less like an attack and more like an intrusion. Near the target, the engine might be pulled back or cut. The aircraft would glide. For the women in the cockpit, that silence was not magical. It was dangerous. An engine at low power meant less control, less margin, less time to correct a bad judgment. The ground came closer. Tracer fire might rise suddenly. A searchlight might catch the wings. The aircraft could become visible at the worst possible second. But for the men below, the effect was unnerving. War had trained them to read sound. The deep cough of artillery. The snap of rifle fire. The grinding approach of vehicles. The distant build of aircraft engines. Men survived by learning what sounds meant. The Po-2 confused that language. There was no heavy roar at first. No clear warning. Just a faint rush like wind where no wind should be. Then impact. Then shouting. Then the aircraft gone into blackness before the camp fully understood what had happened. The nickname that followed, Night Witches, grew from that experience. German soldiers heard the strange sound of the gliding biplanes and reached for a word that belonged to fear more than analysis. It was not a technical report. It was a soldier's name for something that arrived when he was most tired. For the Soviet crews, the tactic demanded discipline that looked simple only from far away. They had to find targets in darkness, often without the navigational advantages larger or later aircraft might possess. They had to time the approach. They had to judge wind. They had to drop small bombs where small bombs could matter. A miss might wake the enemy but damage nothing. A hit might ignite fuel, damage vehicles, break a road movement, or simply convince hundreds of men that sleep was no longer safe. Then came the return flight. That part is easy to forget. A bombing run in a film ends with the explosion. In reality, the aircraft still has to escape. The pilot has to turn away without losing altitude. The navigator has to find the route home. The crew has to avoid friendly fire, German guns, weather, and the thousand small errors that grow larger when bodies are tired. Back at the strip, there was no long rest. Ground crews moved in. Fuel. Bombs. Quick checks. Damage inspected by touch and lamplight. A hole in fabric. A cable problem. A wheel in mud. A tired mechanic deciding whether a plane could fly again. Sometimes the answer was yes because it had to be. And so the sortie cycle continued. One small attack becoming several. Several becoming a night's pattern. A night's pattern becoming a reputation. This was the forbidden or ridiculous idea at the heart of the story. That harassment could be strategic, that sleep could be attacked, that a weak aircraft could be used not despite its limitations but through them. Those who dismissed the Po-2 saw a poor bomber. The women flying it saw a night weapon. The difference was not in the machine. The difference was in the imagination of how war could hurt a man without killing him immediately. German soldiers believed the danger would be measured by the size of the bomb. What really happened was that the real weapon was the interval between bombs, the waiting, the listening, the refusal of the night to end. And once the first missions began, the crews discovered that the dark could hide them, but it could also betray them without warning. The first nights under fire. The first nights did not feel like legend. They felt like cold. They felt like stiff hands, damp boots, bad sleep, and the sour smell of fuel on clothing. They felt like young women trying to appear steady while older instincts in the body warned them not to climb into an aircraft that might not return. Courage at ground level is often much less dramatic than people imagine. It is a person checking a strap twice, folding a map, pretending not to notice another person's silence. The Po-2 waited in the darkness like a fragile thing being asked to do a brutal job. Around it, the ground crew worked quickly because night did not last forever. Bombs were loaded. Fuel was checked. Fabric patches were examined. The engine was listened to with a mechanic's suspicion. A bad engine note could mean the difference between a dangerous mission and a fatal one. When the aircraft lifted from the strip, it did not leap into the sky. Climbed with effort. The ground fell away slowly. The front waited ahead. For a new crew, the first combat flights were a lesson in how much the night could take from you. The map was clear before takeoff. In the air, roads bent strangely. Fires looked like landmarks until they were not. Clouds changed the horizon. Smoke turned distances uncertain. A village could be recognized too late. A river could vanish. The wind could push the aircraft off course gently enough that the mistake became visible only when danger was already near. Then came the German defenses. Searchlights were among the worst. A beam could open across the sky and turn the cockpit white. For a second, the pilot might see her own hands, the wing struts, the exposed shape of the aircraft all too clearly. Below, guns would begin searching for her. Tracers rose like lines being drawn by angry hands. Some passed wide. Some came close enough for the crew to feel the aircraft seem smaller around them. The first burst missed. The second might not. A Po-2 did not offer many comforting answers under fire. Could turn. Could descend. Could use darkness if darkness remained. But it could not rely on armor. Could not simply outrun danger. The pilot had to work with the aircraft honestly, not demand from it what it did not have. This is where the regiment learned the difference between bravery and survival. Bravery could send a crew straight in. Survival required judgment. Approach too high and the aircraft might be seen. Too low and the ground became its own threat. Cut the engine too early and control could suffer. Cut it too late and the sound might warn the target. Drop too soon and the bombs wasted themselves in empty ground. Drop too late and the aircraft might pass into the teeth of the guns. The women learned through repetition, and repetition in combat is never clean. It leaves wreckage behind. It leaves names. It leaves stories told quietly because the official language of war often cannot hold the whole truth of fear. Some aircraft came back with holes in the fabric. Some landed hard. Some crews returned shaking from cold and adrenaline, then had to climb out while others pretended not to stare too long. There were nights when a plane was overdue and the ground seemed to hold its breath. There were nights when the sound of an engine returning brought relief before anyone admitted they had been afraid. The ground crews had their own version of danger. They were not always under the enemy's direct guns, but they lived under the pressure of the mission cycle. A damaged aircraft was not an object. It was a question. Could it fly again? Would a repair hold? Was the risk acceptable? In war, acceptable can become a cruel word. It often means only that the alternative is worse. Inside the regiment, confidence grew slowly. Not the loud confidence of propaganda posters. Something more useful. The confidence of people who know their machine's weaknesses and no longer waste time wishing for another one. The pilots learned how to approach. The navigators learned how to read darkness. The mechanics learned what damage could be patched and what could not be forgiven. The commanders learned who could fly again and who needed 1 hour more, if 1 hour existed. On the German side, the first raids may still have seemed minor. Annoying. Strange. Perhaps humiliating. A camp woken by a small aircraft does not immediately rewrite its understanding of air power. Soldiers complain. Officers file reports. Guns are repositioned. Sentries are warned. But the raids did not stop. And this is where irritation began its slow transformation into something more serious. One night of interrupted sleep can be cursed away. 2 can be endured. A week becomes harder. Men begin to sleep lightly. They begin to hear aircraft that are not there. They begin to dread the hour when they most need rest. They believed these first raids were a nuisance. What really happened was that the regiment was learning how to turn nuisance into pressure. And soon, German camps would discover that the bomb was only one part of the attack. The rest of it happened in the mind before dawn. When German camps stopped sleeping, the Eastern Front had many forms of punishment. Artillery could crush a position in minutes. Tanks could break through a line and leave men running for the rear. Winter could kill without firing a shot. Hunger could hollow out a unit from the inside. Mud could hold trucks until their cargo became useless. But sleep deprivation was quieter. It did not leave the same photographs. It did not produce the dramatic ruins that make destruction easy to understand. A man without sleep can still stand. He can still carry a rifle. He can still answer an officer. On paper, he remains present for duty. That is what makes it dangerous. The night witches did not need to destroy every German camp they attacked. They needed to make the camp uncertain of night. A bomb near the vehicle park. A blast beside a storage area. Tent shredded. A horse or mule panicking in the dark. A truck damaged. A fuel drum burning. A man wounded not in a grand assault, but while trying to rest. Then silence. Then waiting. Then another aircraft. For German soldiers, the pattern became the weapon. The first raid woke them. The second denied them recovery. The third made them angry. The fourth made them listen. Somewhere between anger and exhaustion, contempt began to fail. Imagine a soldier on the ground after midnight. He has marched during the day. He has eaten badly. He has heard artillery in the distance for so long that silence itself feels suspicious. He finally lies down. His boots stay on because no one fully undresses near the front. His rifle is close. He closes his eyes. Then someone shouts. Not clearly. Just a sound moving through the camp. A shape overhead. A thin noise like wind through wires. Men scramble before they understand. The explosion comes. Dirt falls on blankets. A lamp goes out. Someone calls for a medic. Someone else fires upward into nothing. When it ends, the soldier lies down again. But now the body refuses what the mind demands. His ears remain awake. The smallest sound becomes possible danger. A branch. A tarp. A vehicle shifting. A distant aircraft that may be friendly, enemy, or imagined. He does not sleep deeply now. He enters that shallow, broken state where minutes pass but rest does not. Then, perhaps an hour later, another Po-2 comes. This was not merely bombing. It was the fragmentation of time. The night was broken into pieces too small for recovery. Men who needed several hours of rest received scraps. Officers could not count on alert troops in the morning. Drivers made mistakes. Sentries grew jumpy. Mechanics worked slower. Tempers shortened. Judgment thinned. A tired army is still an army, but it is less itself. The Soviet pilots may not have seen all of this from above. They saw flashes, fires, movement, sometimes the outline of panic. They could not fully watch the effect spreading through human nerves, but the effect was there. It entered the camp after the blast and stayed longer than the smoke. The Germans tried to respond. They used searchlights, machine guns, flak, night fighters when possible, altered routines, improved warning systems. They were not passive victims. German soldiers were experienced, disciplined, and often technically skilled. Many of them had survived far worse than night harassment. They adapted because soldiers always try to adapt. But adaptation costs energy too. More sentries meant more men awake. More readiness meant less rest. More attention upward meant less attention elsewhere. Even fear of a raid could do some of the work of the raid itself. If men prepared for an attack that did not come, the Night was still damaged. That was the cruel economy of the tactic. A small aircraft could force a larger response. A small bomb could create a larger disturbance. A limited regiment could impose disproportionate fatigue. The Night Witches were not winning the war by themselves. No single unit can carry a front as vast and savage as the Eastern Front. But they were doing something real. They were taking away one of the few things soldiers desperately needed and rarely had enough of. Sleep. And sleep is not soft. It is not civilian. It is part of combat power. A rested man reacts faster. A rested driver sees the rut before the wheel drops into it. A rested gun crew loads cleaner. A rested officer reads a map with fewer mistakes. A rested sentry hears the real sound and ignores the false one. Take that away night after night, and the front changes by degrees. German camps had believed the Po-2 could not hurt them seriously because its bombs were too small. What they had not seen was that a camp is not only tents and trucks and ammunition. It is also nerves, routines, trust, fatigue, and the expectation that darkness might give a man a few hours back. The Night Witches attacked that expectation. And once the German soldiers stopped sleeping, the question was no longer whether the Po-2 was powerful. The question was how something so weak had forced so many men to live by its schedule. The mathematics of fear. The numbers do not explain everything, but they reveal the shape of the fear. Po-2 could not carry much. That fact had been used against it from the beginning. A small bomb load meant limited destruction per sortie. Limited destruction meant limited importance. That was the clean calculation. But the battlefield produced a different equation. If one aircraft carried only a small load, it had to return. If many crews returned several times a night, the enemy did not experience one raid. He experienced a series of interruptions. Each sortie might last only long enough to cross the line, approach, drop, and escape. But each one reached beyond the moment of impact. The mathematics of the Night Witches was not just weight of explosives. It was frequency. A man can sleep after a loud noise if he believes it is over. He cannot sleep properly if he believes it may return without warning. This is why repetition mattered. The second raid was not simply another attack. It reinterpreted the first. It told the men below that the first explosion had not been an event. It had been the beginning of a pattern. Reports and post-war accounts often emphasize how many sorties the regiment flew and how often crews might go out repeatedly in a single night. Some accounts describe 8, 10, even more sorties under certain conditions. Numbers like that should be handled carefully, because wartime records, memory, and retelling do not always align perfectly. But what matters is not only the exact number. It is what the number reveals. The aircraft's weakness forced repetition. Repetition created pressure. Pressure became fear. Fear consumed rest. This is how a small machine created an effect larger than its payload. The Po-2's slowness also carried an irony that German pilots could not easily dismiss. Fast fighters were built around speed, climb, and combat performance. Against many aircraft, speed was life. But against something extremely slow, especially at night and low altitude, speed could become awkward. Closing too fast, overshooting, struggling to locate a faint target in darkness. These were real problems. The Po-2 was vulnerable, but not always easy prey in the way a daytime comparison suggested. Again, the battlefield punished assumptions. They had believed slow meant helpless. What really happened was that slow, used in darkness, could become difficult in its own way. The same was true of simplicity. A simple aircraft could be repaired quickly, could operate from rough fields. It did not demand the same infrastructure as more advanced machines. For a unit working close to the front, constantly shaped by mud, movement, and shortage, simplicity was not merely backwardness. It was availability, and availability matters in war. A perfect aircraft that cannot fly tonight is less useful tonight than an old one that can. This does not mean the Po-2 was secretly superior to modern aircraft. It was not. It was fragile. It was limited. It was dangerous for its crews. But superiority is not the only measure of usefulness. Sometimes the question is narrower and more brutal. Can this machine perform this mission under these conditions better than the enemy expects? For the night witches, the answer was yes. Their raids also imposed a defensive tax. German units had to spend attention, ammunition, manpower, and nerves against an aircraft that did not appear worth such effort on paper. Fire too much at shadows and ammunition is wasted. Fire too little, and the next bomb may land among vehicles or sleeping men. Keep everyone awake, and the raid succeeds even if no bomb hits a major target. Let them sleep and risk being caught unprepared. There was no perfect answer. That was the strength of harassment. The damage lived in the choice. A large bombing raid announces a crisis. A harassment raid creates uncertainty. It forces small decisions repeatedly, and each decision carries cost. Wake the men or let them rest. Move the trucks or keep them hidden. Fire now or wait. Send a runner? Turn on lights? Stay quiet? Report it as minor? Admit the unit is being worn down? War is filled with these small decisions. They rarely look historic from the outside. But inside a camp at 3 o'clock, with men shouting and a wounded soldier asking for help, they are the war. The night witches understood, perhaps instinctively at first and then professionally, that small actions repeated at the right time could produce strategic texture. They made the German rear less comfortable. They made rest less reliable. They made the night contested. And in war, contested night changes the day. Because morning does not ask whether a man slept. It asks him to fight anyway. By dawn, the German soldier who had been woken 3 times still had to move. The driver still had to start the truck. The gun crew still had to respond. The officer still had to read orders. The sentry still had to remain alert. The body does not care that the bombs were small. The nervous system counts the interruptions. The mathematics of fear was not written in one explosion. It was written in hours stolen from thousands of men, in shallow sleep, in false alarms, in hands that moved slower at sunrise, in eyes that searched the sky long after the aircraft had gone. But there is another side to the equation. Every sortie that cost the Germans sleep also cost the women something. Cold, risk, fatigue, luck, and sometimes life. The price paid in wood, fabric, and flesh. Legend can make danger look clean, can turn young women into symbols, aircraft into icons, nicknames into triumph. But the real regiment lived in a harsher place than legend. It lived on airfields where mud grabbed at wheels, where engines failed, where weather closed in, where one small mistake in darkness could erase a crew before anyone understood what had gone wrong. The Po-2 gave the night witches their method. It also gave them very little protection. When bullets hit a metal aircraft, there is at least a chance they strike something that resists. When bullets tore into a Po-2, they met fabric, wood, wire, fuel, flesh. A hole in the wing might be survivable. A damaged control cable might not. Fire was a terrible possibility. So was a crash in enemy territory, a forced landing in darkness, a navigational error that brought the aircraft over the wrong guns. The women knew this. They did not need anyone to explain vulnerability to them. They sat inside it every night. Cold was another enemy. At altitude, in an open cockpit, wind does not simply touch the body. It works on it. Fingers stiffen. Eyes water. The face becomes numb. Thought slows at the edges. A pilot still has to feel the controls. A navigator still has to read a map. The mission still demands precision from bodies being worn down by weather and fear. Then came fatigue. The German camps were not the only places where sleep was broken. The night witches themselves lived by an unnatural rhythm. Rest during the day when possible. Prepare by evening. Fly by night. Return, reload, fly again. There is a point at which exhaustion becomes more than discomfort. It becomes a hazard. It makes a familiar checklist uncertain. It makes a person forget a step. It turns seconds into fog. And yet the work continued. A crew returned from a sortie. The aircraft rolled in. The engine coughed down. Ground crew moved close. No one had time to treat the machine like a relic. It was inspected by hands, lamplight, instinct. Bullet holes were found. Fabric was patched. Fuel was added. Bombs were loaded. A mechanic might notice something in the engine note and lean closer, trying to decide whether concern was caution or fear. That decision mattered. If the aircraft was held back, a sortie was lost. If it flew damaged, the crew might be lost. War often gives people choices like that and then records only the result. The human cost of the regiment must be told without exaggeration because the truth is heavy enough. Some women survived hundreds of missions. Some became highly decorated. Some returned home after the war carrying memories no ceremony could translate. Others did not return at all. Their absence was felt first not by history, but by the people who waited for an engine that never came back. Imagine an airstrip before dawn. The sky is not yet light, but the darkness is thinning. A few aircraft have returned. Men and women on the ground can tell the difference between engines by sound now. They know who is late. They do not say much. Saying too much gives fear a shape. Then one expected sound does not appear. There is no dramatic music in that moment. Just people working because work is the only thing preventing collapse. Another aircraft must be loaded. Another crew must go. Someone may look toward the horizon one more time. Someone may not. The night witches were not untouchable figures moving through myth. They were military aviators doing a dangerous job in machines that offered almost no forgiveness. Their courage was not theatrical. It was procedural. It lived in repeated actions. Climb in, check controls, lift off, find the target, return if possible. The phrase, if possible, sat behind every mission. German soldiers paid in lost sleep and fear. Soviet crews paid in risk taken again and again until risk became routine. But routine did not make the danger smaller. It only made it familiar. Some of the women were recognized as heroes of the Soviet Union. Some names became part of the regiment's memory. Nadezhda Popova, Natalia Meklin, Rufina Gashieva, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, and others whose records deserve careful verification before full production. Their medals tell one part of the story. The torn wings tell another. The empty places at the airfield tell another still. A documentary must be careful here. It is easy to admire the night witches by making them seem fearless. It is more honest to understand that they were afraid and flew anyway. They were not powerful because fear never reached them. They were powerful because fear did not get the final decision every night. They believed the old aircraft was the main weakness. What really happened was that the women inside it bore the true cost of making weakness useful. And as the raids continued, both sides began to understand that this dismissed regiment had earned something rare in war. A name spoken by the enemy with unease. From insult to name of terror. Names matter at the front. Soldiers name things because official language is too slow. They name roads, guns, fields, aircraft, hills, dangers, habits, even fears. A nickname can compress an entire experience into a few words. Can be cruel. Can be funny. Can be bitter. Can reveal more than the speaker intends. Night witches began on the German side as a name for something unwanted and difficult to stop. It was not a respectful title at first. Carried contempt. The women were enemies. The aircraft was primitive. The sound was strange. German soldiers, hearing the faint rush of air through the Po-2 structure during night approaches, reached for an image that belonged to folklore and dread. A witch in the night. Something unnatural. Something that came when men were trying to sleep. The name was supposed to reduce them. Instead, it preserved the fear. The women of the regiment took the insult and wore it differently. This is one of the quiet reversals in the story. A word created by frightened enemies became a badge of identity. Not because the pilots believed in superstition, but because they understood what the nickname admitted. German troops had noticed. German troops were listening. German troops had stopped treating the raids as harmless. Recognition from one's own command came in a different language. Reports, sortie counts, decorations, the redesignation of the regiment as a guards unit, the accumulation of missions that could no longer be dismissed as novelty. The war machine, which had once made room for them under pressure, now had to acknowledge results. But official recognition often arrives late because institutions prefer evidence they can count. The first frightened German sentry had understood something before the paperwork did. The first sleepless camp had understood it. The first officer forced to adjust night discipline because of repeated Po-2 raids had understood it. The battlefield recognized the regiment through inconvenience first, then through fear, then through necessity. There is a difference between being celebrated and being understood. The night witches could be celebrated as brave women, and that was true. But if the story stops there, it becomes too small. Their importance was not only that they were women in combat, though that alone mattered. Their importance was that they mastered a specific kind of war, night harassment, psychological pressure, and the intelligent use of a limited machine. They were not successful because the Po-2 was secretly a wonder weapon. It was not. They were successful because they matched aircraft, mission, environment, and human weakness with unusual precision. German camps needed sleep. The Po-2 could take it. German soldiers trusted darkness. The Po-2 could enter it. German defenses expected certain kinds of air threats. The Po-2 did not always behave like those threats. German contempt gave the regiment time to prove itself. By the time the nickname became widely known, the old belief had already been damaged. No one who had spent enough nights under those raids could honestly call them harmless in the same way again. A soldier might still curse the aircraft as primitive. He might still say the bombs were small. He might still claim that real danger came from artillery or tanks. But when darkness fell, he listened. That listening was the regiment's reputation. Not every raid hit. Not every mission succeeded. Not every German soldier was terrified. War is never that simple. Some men adapted. Some mocked what frightened others. Some fired back with skill and discipline. Some Po-2s were shot down. Some crews died. The story is not a fairy tale of invincibility. It is more interesting because of that. A vulnerable regiment using vulnerable aircraft forced a professional enemy to spend attention on them night after night. It turned insult into operational fact. It made a name meant to belittle them into evidence that they had entered the enemy's mind. The Germans had believed the night witches were a strange irritation. What really happened was that irritation became a form of control. And behind that control was a larger lesson, not only about women in war, but about what armies fail to see when they mistake appearance for value. What the night witches changed. The night witches did not change the war by introducing a new machine. They changed it by revealing an old truth that modern armies often forget. The value of a weapon depends on how, when, and against whom it is used. The Po-2 did not become faster because women flew it. It did not become armored. It did not become a heavy bomber by force of courage. It remained what it was: slow, fragile, limited, and simple. The regiment's genius was not pretending otherwise. It was accepting the machine honestly and building tactics around what it could actually do. That may be the deepest military lesson in the story. Many failures in war begin with forcing a tool to serve an idea it cannot support. The night witches did the opposite. They looked at the Po-2 and found a mission that made its weaknesses less fatal and its small strengths more important. Low-speed handling, rough field operation, ease of repair, night approach, repetition, psychological effect. The result was not glamorous. It was effective. Their legacy also belongs to the history of women in combat, but here too the story needs care. They should not be remembered only because they were women doing what men believed women could not. That framing still leaves men's disbelief at the center. The women deserve to be remembered as combat professionals. Pilots, navigators, mechanics, commanders, armorers, people who learned a difficult job and performed it under conditions that would have tested anyone. They expanded the idea of who could serve not by argument alone, but by endurance. Still, war did not reward them evenly. Memory rarely does. Some became famous. Some were decorated. Some lived long enough to tell parts of the story. Others disappeared into records, family photographs, or the silence that follows too many wars. The regiment became legendary, but individuals can be lost inside legend. That is why returning to the small details matters. A gloved hand on a control stick. A mechanic's ear near an engine. A navigator counting seconds in the dark. A pilot trying to land with damage she could feel but not fully see. A German soldier lying awake after the raid, angry at himself for listening to the sky. These details keep the story human. The night witches also remind us that psychological warfare is not always created by elaborate deception plans or secret technologies. Sometimes it is created by persistence, by arriving at the hour when the enemy is weakest, by forcing him to spend energy on uncertainty, by making him prepare for you even when you are not there. That last point matters. The greatest effect of a feared weapon often occurs outside the moment it is used. A soldier who hears the Po-2 once may be frightened. A soldier who expects it every night has already surrendered part of his rest to it. The weapon has entered time. It has changed the hours before it arrives. That was the night witches' quiet achievement. They made the night active. For German troops, darkness was no longer just a cover, a rest period, or a pause between larger operations. It became a contested space. A place where old aircraft could pass overhead and disturb the fragile machinery of sleep, morale, and readiness. Once that happened, the Eastern Front had one more pressure point. Not decisive alone, but real. And war is made of real pressures accumulating until something gives. The regiment's story remains compelling because it overturns several beliefs at once. That old equipment is useless. That women could not endure combat aviation. That small bombs create only small effects. That sleep is outside the battlefield. That fear belongs only to the side under heavy attack. Each belief met reality. Reality was colder. The night witches did not need to become mythic to matter. They mattered because they worked, suffered, adapted, and returned. They mattered because German soldiers who had dismissed them in daylight listened for them after midnight. They mattered because the difference between harmless and dangerous was not written on the aircraft's specifications. It was written in the camps that stopped sleeping. And in the end, after the medals, the nickname, the old photographs, and the surviving aircraft in museums, the story comes back to one sound in the dark. Faint, almost fragile, and impossible to ignore once a man knew what followed it. The sound in the dark. Return to the night over the German lines. The time is still 2:17. The Po-2 is still descending through cold air, its wings holding just enough lift, its engine quieted near the target. The pilot's hands are still stiff. The navigator is still watching the ground, measuring distance in seconds and instinct. Below, a German camp is still trying to sleep because men at war must sleep whenever the front allows it. But now we understand what that moment contains. It is not just an aircraft approaching a target. It is every assumption that brought both sides there. The Germans believed real danger should look powerful. They believed it should sound like massed engines, artillery, armored columns, heavy bombers, something obvious enough to respect before it arrived. They believed a slow biplane could be mocked because it was outdated, because its bombs were small, because its crews were women, because war had taught them to measure threat in steel and speed. Many Soviet skeptics had believed something similar in another form. They believed the regiment might be symbolic, useful perhaps, but limited. They believed the women would have to prove what male units were often allowed to assume. They believed an old aircraft was a compromise. The battlefield did not care what anyone believed. Tested only what worked. And what worked in those hours before dawn was not the grand theory of air power. It was the humble, punishing rhythm of return. One sortie, then another. One camp woken, then another. One night broken into pieces, then another. The Po-2 did not dominate the sky. It haunted a specific part of it. That distinction matters. The night witches were not invincible. They were not untouched by fear. They did not fly magic aircraft. They did not win the war alone, and no honest telling should place that burden on them. They were part of a vast, brutal, collective struggle on a front where millions suffered and countless acts of courage disappeared without record. But their story endures because it shows how war can be changed by people who are not supposed to matter. A dismissed pilot, a tired navigator, a mechanic working by poor light, an old aircraft patched one more time, a small bomb loaded because that was what the mission allowed, a German soldier awake in the dark, listening. There is no need to exaggerate the scene. The truth carries enough weight. The aircraft comes in low. The engine fades. The wind moves through wires and struts. A man below opens his eyes. For 1 second, there is only that sound. Then the night breaks open. By morning, the camp may still exist. The road may still be there. Most of the men may still be alive. A report may describe damage as limited. A commander may file the raid under nuisance, harassment, minor disruption. But the men who were there know what the report cannot measure. They know how long it took to sleep again. They know how many times they woke after that to sounds that were not aircraft. They know how darkness changed. That is the final truth of the night witches. Their power was not only in what they destroyed, but in what they denied. Rest, certainty, contempt, the comfort of believing that weak things are safe to ignore. They believed Soviet night bombers were harmless. But what really happened was this. A fragile wooden aircraft, flown by women many had underestimated, turned the night itself into a weapon, and taught German camps that sleep could be lost long before the battle began. If the story reached you, leave a comment with where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served, in any uniform, on any front, you are welcome to share their name or their story below. WW2 Warfront is built around the forgotten corners of the war, the moments when belief met reality, and ordinary people were forced to carry the weight of history. Subscribe to follow the next story.